Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we are looking at one of the seminal works of my teenage years, or foundational works, or some... the point is, this book had a very significant effect on how I looked at modern art. I was assigned this book to read in high school, and that my art teacher at the time, who assigned this, she was very, very good at teaching art history. She spent a little bit less time on teaching the actual doing of art, which is the reason why I wound up transferring my major from art practicum to art history / art criticism, and that's because I learned that she hadn't taught me nearly as much about, painting and sculpture and stuff as she had taught me about talking about painting and sculpture and stuff. But anyways, Tom Wolfe. This is an extremely sardonic look at the modern art scene of the mid-20th century. And, like I said, this had a very, very big impact on me. The thing is that what it explains is part of the reason why art is not for the masses, because in a lot of ways and cases it isn't. And sometimes the art world can be so very internally self-referential, can be so very navel-gazing in its way, that sometimes they lose sight of the fact that they're not in fact talking to the people, they are talking to the people in the art world. So let's go through this. I'm not going to probably wind up reading you some excerpts from these books, but I'm just going to kind of go through the book and what he says, but you should really read it because he's a lot more entertaining than I am. So he starts by talking about realism, because the thing is that paintings, obviously, 100 years ago, before we had photography, of course, you needed paintings because if you wanted to have a picture of what someone or something looked like, someone had to go paint it. But in the mid-1800s, you had people like Jean-François Millet with The Sower here. And the thing about realism was that it was designed to show things as they were. You see, medieval painting had been very much about showing things in a much more metaphysical way. It's why when you look at a medieval painting, Jesus or a saint or what have you will be so much bigger than everything else, and that's because being more important, Jesus should be bigger. Or a king will be bigger than the nobility, and so on and so forth. The scaling is not done in a way that's designed to look like it's real. It's designed in a way to represent things as they are, but in a metaphorical way, in a not physical presence way. With the Renaissance, people started working on things like perspective and, making hyper-realistic stuff, and so paintings started to look more real in that they looked like something that could have been happening in the real world. But painters of the Renaissance and the Baroque and the Rococo were very often, and into the classical period, of course, were very often doing these very, very smooth paintings that, if they weren't of, royalty and stuff, they tended to be of historical events or mythology or something of that nature, and it wasn't designed to be of somebody real, unless, like I said, you were painting somebody's portrait. It was designed to tell a story. And painting like that, it continues until you get to people like the realists who said, no, let's paint something that's actually here in front of us. There's a dude and he's in a field and he's having to sow grain, and that's what it looks like. And then you got the Impressionists, who were trying to show, as is in the name, their impressions of things. How does this look in a bunch of different lights? How do these dancers look when they're backstage and not in front of everybody performing? How do I make create something that makes you see how this moment looks and feels in reality. Realism was sort of about nitty-gritty. It's about saying painting isn't just of rich people and the elite in history, it's of that real person there. But Impressionism was more about making you sort of get a sense of who these people were and what this scene was in any given moment, in any given situation. And then you got the Expressionists who would do things like say, here's a painting of a real woman, but I'm gonna paint her skin green so we can get that she's sick. But then you also start getting into the Cubists, and Cubism is where we start having theory appear, and this is, as it is the next picture in the book, I had done Georges Braque's Maisons à l'état, or Houses à l'état, from 1908, and you can see how this is abstracted, and that's because it's about shape and form. It's about showing the shapes of the houses and how those shapes appear from a great many angles. It's not about showing you something realistic, it's about shapes. And it sort of gets put into a manifesto. Now, Picasso is obviously the most famous Cubist, but Georges Braque is a very close second. But following this, we get his discussion of what he entitles the Apache Dance, and that is that you start getting these artists who are trapped betwixt and between, because you have the starving artist trope. You get off here, hot off the Cary Airport bus, looking for lofts, as he says, and they're all dressed the same, and they're all going to the same part of New York, and they're all looking for those lofts where they can express their fine-honed disdain for the bourgeoisie who don't understand their art or understand art at all. But you also want to find a sponsor. You want to find somebody who will support you, who will pay scandalous amounts of money for your paintings. And from there you get people like Picasso who managed to walk that line where you're covering both things, where on the one hand you have to dedicate yourself to the quirky god avant-garde, but at the same time you also have to, you have to make yourself available for somebody to pay you money for your art. And he calls it a consummation, that it's an art mating ritual. And that every year you would have a whole bunch of people who show up in boho, and the artist shows his stuff within the circles, coteries, movements, isms of the home neighborhood, as if he doesn't care about anything else, as if in fact he has a knife in his teeth against the fashionable world uptown. And then the culturati find them and, will pay them, and it is described as a mating dance with an amusing description of the final consummation, as he calls it. And from there, you had this back and forth, and from there developed theory. And he uses this picture at the start of his chapter about Clement Greenberg and Rosenberg, who came up with these various theories that they supported people. And you have here When Flat Was God, where the idea is you're trying not to make too many bumps above the picture plane with your thickened paint, because it's all about flatness. This theory that a painting is nothing more than an image, something demonstrating how your painting is nothing but color on canvas, which is how we get to the support of Jackson Pollock's She-Wolf. Now, this is the early 40s, and Greenberg was a big proponent of Jackson Pollock. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that there is an animal shape in there. You can see the teats and the bumps of the body and so on, but this isn't a picture of a wolf. It's kind of this abstracted, lumpy thing. For those who don't know, just so you're aware, this is what Jackson Pollock is best known for, is paintings that look like this one. This is Number 1, or Lavender Cloud, I think it is. The point is that Jackson Pollock here is, among other things, not expressing anything specific. He's very specifically not saying this is a this or that is supposed to evoke this emotion. He's just putting paint on. And from there we get the next level as is described in, again, this book, where we get to talking about Morris Lewis's The Third Element from 1961 or 62, depending on which source you're going for, but this book says 62, so I'm going with it. And he's watered down the paints to a watercolor consistency, and now there is nothing hovering above the picture plane, it's just flat. And the work becomes more and more self-referential until you reach a point where you got pop artists, because pop artists got abruptly very, very sarcastic about this whole non-realism art thing and put out this. And this is Roy Lichtenstein's We Rose Up Slowly, where he just basically blew up a picture from a comic book and then painted it. And the thing about this is that they said, well, we're not painting two people kissing. What we're painting is the signs and symbols apparent in the image. That it's not a picture of something, it's signs and symbols. And that it was the excuse they used, as Tom Wolfe describes it, to evade the fact that the then current modernist dialogue was that picture painting was passé. You don't paint a picture of something. And these became very, very popular, and it is, of course, obvious and implicit that part of the reason it became popular is because people buying paintings for their homes like to buy something that looks like something, that they can point at and say, oh yeah, that's a thing. I know what I'm looking at. But the theory of this was a whole bunch of stuff, and this was kind of just expressing those paragraphs of theory. And finally, we have what was sort of the most recent thing at the time of writing this book, and that was photorealism, which this is Richard Estes's bus reflection from 72, which was only 3 years before this book was written. And what he did was he did a photograph, and then he point by point recreated the photograph with as invisible brushstrokes as possible so that this looks exactly like the sidewalk that he took the photograph on. And what Tom Wolfe describes at the end of this book is the point where painting steps beyond painting and into the painted word. Because the upshot of this book is the notion that painting has become not visuals where you look at something and figure out what's in the painting. It's become an illustration of paragraphs of theory. And he describes at the end of this book something that he found in an art museum in Florida, in which you have this woman who wrote paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of description. And he says, and it was just typed sheets of paper on a wall in effect, and he was in the presence of, as he put it, superb post-Proustian literature. And that modern art had stepped beyond images and into being nothing more than words. And this notion of art being nothing more than an illustration is something problematic that does dog the art community, and that some of them don't even realize it. And so it's a great book. It's a fun book, and it's an interesting book, and it's a pointed book, and I think it's worth reading because it's a great time. And that's all I have to say, and I will see you all next week.